Talk to me about, you just touched on something there, the breathing. We've spoken a little bit about nasal breathing. It's something I've started to play around with. It's very difficult at first. It takes some, it almost takes, it takes a few times until you get comfortable with that panic breath, where you really want to open your mouth and just take a big gulp of air. Where did you start to become exposed to the idea of nasal breathing, and when did you start to implement it?
So, again, it was lucky because, man, this Vegas trip taught me a lot, because even that with Geordie, he was real into the cold exposure and that. Like, even before we did that trip, I wasn't comfortable in the cold, but I would get it done sort of thing. But it wasn't like, I remember I did an ice bath and I was like, man, it lasted like 30 seconds. I was like, I could do it, but it wasn't enjoyable, it wasn't pleasant. I didn't get that good feeling after. I'm like, I just hated the whole experience sort of thing. And I was talking to Geordie and he was telling me there's like all these benefits. And he's like, when you do the cold, because at the Performance Institute, they had a hot spa, a cold plunge, which is about like 3 or 4 degrees, and a sauna. And he's like, and I jumped in the cold plunge, and first reaction, I was like, almost make myself hyperventilate. And he's like, oh, how long do you go? I'm like, 20 seconds a killer. He's like, jump in and just breathe through your nose. I was like, oh, what's this fucking wishy-washy bullshit sort of thing? Like, I don't know if I believe in that. And I jumped in and I was like, and then I started breathing through my nose, and I was like, 35 seconds, the longest I've done. I'm like, straight away, I'm like, there's some legitness to this sort of thing. Then I was like, oh, can you like tell me more? He showed me, like, there's a guy in New Zealand, Dave Wood. He works with all the city kickboxing boys and that. He does a lot of like the breathing, the cold exposure and that sort of thing.
Yep.
And then it was just sort of trying to find little bits of information from different sort of avenues that can increase performance. Like we talked about the heat, getting used to the heat, that increases your performance in this way. This breathing increases your performance. Perfect example was my last long run I did think 30 Ks. And it was like at a 4:31 pace, I think.
Which is insane. Yeah. For anyone listening, ridiculous.
And then I remember I finished my run and I was looking at the time and I was like 4 minutes 33 and I hit my distance. And I was like, man, I'm like, I wonder if I can get that down to 4:30. And then so I was nasal breathing pretty much the whole thing. There was a couple of hills up Shore Harbour and that. Whereas what I'd do before, I would sort of... So I'd be nasal breathing the whole time, keeping a good baseline. Then as soon as I'd be about 100 meters out, I'd almost oversaturate myself with oxygen. And by the time I'm already halfway up, I'm back to nasal breathing. But because I'm sort of so amped, I've already elevated my heart rate up for the breathing. You just cruise up and you can keep the same pace sort of thing. And then it was funny. I finished my last K, I think at like just 4 minutes, something like almost 4:50 or something. It was pretty slow towards the end sort of thing. But then I was like, man, I wonder what I can do the last K. And I ended up sprinting like the last K after I did the whole distance, like 3 minutes 52. It was like my fastest K, but I just went straight, big, long nose inhales, just like really deep breathing. And as soon as I finished that run, and then I was like, man, there's got to be like, even though I'm doing it, I'm like, and I'm telling myself it's working, like sometimes it can be a placebo effect or something, but I'm like, it's visually working for me. A perfect example now is when we're doing our lactic workouts, a minute on the assault bike, a minute on heavy bag, rinse and repeat for X amount of times. And it's pretty much, you're trying to hit as high a number as you can on the assault bike. And I used to do it, I used to go 2 seconds in, I'm huffing and puffing out of my mouth, really breathing, really sort of overexpanding everything where I don't need to be, because even though I'm putting out a really high input, there's no need for my body to be working that hard 2 seconds in. So now what I try and do is I try and hit the same numbers, say for like an RPM, I might try and hit at least a 90 RPM, and then I try and breathe throughout, and I try and stay at least nasal breathing or at least deep, slow breathing for as long as I can. 30 seconds in, I'm just as sort of cooked like physically and that from it. But then when I can switch up my breathing pattern and I can like, oh, okay, now I can use my mouth. It almost gives you like an extra boost sort of thing, because everybody's so used to, it's the first thing you're going to do if you get told to sprint 100 meters. You're going to really start short, shallow breathing sort of thing, which is good because it works that system. But when you have to sort of translate that for like a minute or, per example, or fight intervals, like if you're breathing like this the whole fight, you're going to gas yourself out. You need to be able to match your breathing with the exercise intensity. And I feel like it's something that breathwork has taught me to do, as well as like you're saying with like the anxiety or anything like that. Even sometimes when I get nerves, like couple weeks out from a fight, I'll go down to the lake. I'll just chuck binaural beats in, sort of like the song sort of playlist and that, listen to that. Then it's just box breathing, like 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, rinse and repeat. You can do like 4 to 6 and just change the ratios like that. And I found like a good way that I got told from, it was an audiobook I think I was listening to, and they said the best thing about the breath is that it's something that's always with you. Like no matter what situation you're in, some trainers might have a phone, you might not have company, but if all you can do is sort of bring yourself back to breathing, getting comfortable in that situation, you can really sort of find sort of that familiarity in sort of uncomfortable situations.
For sure. So the thing that fascinates me the most about the breathing is a mate of mine from down in Adelaide, Kane Rice. He's a bit of a weapon, like, used to be like an endurance cyclist and had a bunch of accidents on the bike where he had sort of like blood clots and heaps of shit going on. He's just like one of those guys, like a real warrior, just fights through all these injuries and shit. And he done 45 days in a row of walking a marathon a day. Oof. So he's putting his body through some shit. And we were just talking about breathing, and he said to me, listen to this podcast with James Nestor, and he's a guy who focuses a lot on the breath. And I tried it. I think it was the first time, because see, the thing is, I don't run solo that often. Yeah, I've always kind of got mates around, so it's hard because you're in conversation most of the time. So I was like, I've got this solo run, I'm going to do 10 Ks. I'm going to try and nasal breathe for as long as I can. Mm-hmm. And I managed to last the 10 Ks, which probably helped. I'd been in the gym like for 2 weeks before, just doing it in my gym workouts. Mm-hmm. And it's hard, and you want to panic breathe, like when you start to get tired, but just trying to fight through it. And one of the things that Kane sort of explained to me, and this James Nestor guy talks about, is because of the structure of the nasal system, the way that the air has to travel to get in and out of the lungs, as opposed to it just coming straight up and out the mouth. It's a slower process to get in and to get out, which regulates and slows the heart rate. And I noticed that on the runs I was nasal breathing, my heart rate was lower. Yep. It was easier to control it. It wasn't as sporadic. And the thing that I noticed, which was probably the most notable thing as a whole, and I think this is just a little bit of common sense too, but my mouth wasn't dry. Yep. So like I felt really relaxed, and I didn't feel like I was dehydrated. And naturally, like when you're running for a long time, you want to drink heaps, but you're not always accessible to water unless you're carrying a pack or a bottle. And I just felt so much better. So my thing was like, every opportunity I get where I'm running solo or training solo now, just try to nasal breathe. And you feel good. And it's funny because we spoke a little bit before when we weren't recording about the essence of just human nature and the prehistoric nature. The prehistoric nature of who we are at the core and who we are prehistorically, and the fact that we're so impressed with our ability to run, 21 Ks, 42 Ks, yet it's so natural. And I think breath is the same thing. We've become so comfortable in modern society with all the gadgets, the sedentary nature of our lifestyle, the comfort that we live within, that we've forgotten that really at the core, like the things that you used to have to think about were breathing and controlling your natural state, staying warm or staying cool, depending on the climate, hunting and eating and gathering, and just staying alive, just survival. And really survival is just the essence of what life once was. And everything was so natural, like you'd run and hunt to eat food. We spoke about this program that I watched, may have even spoken about it before on the podcast. It's called Boy to Man, made by an Aussie director, Tim Noonan. And he would go into these tribal communities who were living like they always had. And the episode that I remember, I watched the whole series, about an 8-week series that was on Discovery Channel at the time. I reckon you could probably track it down if you wanted to on YouTube or something. And the cool thing about it was he wasn't just going in as a director and a producer and just sitting back and watching this unfold. He was living like them. And so I still remember one ep, they pierced his nose with a bull ring and done all this crazy shit. But this one particular episode that stood out to me, he was with this Mayan tribe, and they were from around the Amazon area. It was very hot, dry, desert-like. So it wasn't actually in the Amazon as such. It was sort of outside of that area, South America, wherever the mines live. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? And hot, dry days, very little access to food. These guys would go out in the morning and hunt boars. Like, boars were pretty much the go-to food. And he was saying that this morning they've gone out, some of them barefoot, some with just like these handmade sandals on, and they ran for hours chasing this boar. And they had vision of them chasing this boar, and they're trying to spear it. And I think they'd run the equivalent of like somewhere between like 20 odd and 40 odd Ks day by day when they track this. But often days they wouldn't catch anything, and they'd come back and sit and eat this like handful of corn. I can't even remember whether it was corn kernels or whether it looked something along the lines of like popcorn.
Okay, yeah.
Like, it didn't even look like corn like we'd eat. Like, it looked so minute and so low in calories that it really made me think, we've become so comfortable in this life that we forget that like how simple human nature truly is, and how little is actually needed to survive, but how much they thrive because they're really in touch with their body and what they need. And it's crazy that we've forgotten how important things like breath are, movement, not being sedentary, like little things like sleeping out in natural light, you know, to regulate circadian rhythms. And something I've started doing recently is being a little bit more in tune with my morning routine. I was listening to a guy, Andrew Huberman, who spoke about, and he's like, for anyone who hasn't listened to Andrew Huberman, he's got a podcast called Huberman Labs. Absolute genius. And just like so smart. He was talking about this basically in the morning when you wake. The most important thing is getting out in natural sunlight early, because it regulates cortisol levels, release of adenosine. It allows your body to wake up, just being out in yellow light in the sun. And he was speaking about the release of particularly adenosine and how caffeine blocks adenosine receptors. And I was someone who would wake up at 4:30 to 4:45 every morning. First thing I do, go have a long black, sort of get the system moving, go out,
wake up that bit sort of thing. Yeah,
exactly. And he was saying that a lot of people think pump all your caffeine early because it allows you to get a little bit rested and relaxed at night. Like, you sleep better. But he said, actually, like, if you're pumping 2 or 3 coffees early, you've not given yourself the ability to release adenosine yet. What happens is, once caffeine detaches from receptors, which takes time, it takes hours, then adenosine spikes late in the day. Now your body's not actually in a sleeping state by the time it's supposed to sleep. Yeah. It's still waking, which means that you might go to sleep. You might get, 6, 7, 8 hours, but you're not actually rested. Yep. And it's so interesting to me because we forget that at the core, the way that we were designed, the life that we were supposed to live, was waking up because the sun started to rise, not because the alarm clock went off, not because you had to get up and get to work for a meeting, or because you had a late night the night before. It's kind of like you'd wake up with the sunrise, your body would start to chemically do what it's supposed to do, because the signal of natural yellow light sort of goes to the neurotransmitters in your retina and says, wake up, release these chemicals. And likewise in the evening, where your body recognizes it's been awake for, 12, 13, 14 hours by the time the sun starts to set, and the offset of that natural yellow light again is saying, hey, release melatonin to start to rest. Yep. And because we used to be outside and amongst nature for the waking and the sleeping, this all just happened naturally. But we've started to build all these comforts into our life that bring us so out of touch. And that's my point. Me, long story long all the time.
No, but it's
so true.
I was going to say, because you make a great point there, because how often do you see people, like, there's so many more people trying to do nature retreats and that, where they're trying to get back out of nature. People, how much more popular, I could only imagine how much more, like, say, even the term social media or detox or phone detox would have become over, like, the last 10 years, because 10 years ago, it wasn't too much of a problem because, like, 10 years ago, I would have been 12 and that. My biggest problem was coming home from school and, like, wrestling with my brother on my trampoline or doing something like going for a skate ride to a park or something like that. We see kids these days, they come back, they're just straight on the cell phones and stuff like that. And it's really sort of disruptive and, like, it's crazy how...
It's actually sad.
It is, definitely. And, like...